Actually, her boyfriend works there. I have to hang out with all my friends. Hi, I'm Nari. I have friends. I know. What is it? It's your sister's business. It's still really fun. They should stay or go down. No, I wouldn't. But 9 years.
Right. All right, well, welcome to the School of Visual Arts, welcome to the Design Criticism MFA department. Great to see you here this afternoon. Oh, and happy Valentine's Day. I'm Alice Twemlow, the chair of the department, and extremely minimal role this lunchtime, because I'm going to turn over the floor to two of our first year students who are hosting this lunchtime Q&A with Michael Kimmelman, senior critic at York Times. So I usually do a longer spiel about how fabulous the design criticism department is, but suffice to say it's application season, and if you'd like to talk to me about any aspect of the program, please call me afterwards. I'm happy to talk about that. But for now, I'd like to introduce two of our first year students, Bridget Brown and Bryn Smith, who are going to host this lunchtime event. Thanks for coming.
I'm Bridget Brown. Good afternoon, and thank you guys for coming. And thank you, Michael, for taking time out of your lunch to come with us. From the moment Michael published his first piece from the York Times as the architecture critic, all of us at DCRIT took notice. Not only because it made the front page, which I think is something to brag about, and not only because it's Michael Kimmelman and he has a background in art history and experiences in music, art, and architecture critic. But of course all of that mattered, but most importantly to us, it was interesting and we were intrigued by the fact that Michael could talk about a subsidized housing project through talking about the way it works in the community. He wasn't just talking about a box and its interior, but how it works within the urban fabric. If anything, his first piece gave us hope. Hope that there weren't any solitary rules or regulations that define criticism. But something we all find exciting, if nothing else. So we will continue to watch Michael as he challenges and questions the field as the readers, and just as we at DCRIT are learning to do the same. But the question remains if we, as students, are bold enough to suggest moving to Madison Square Garden.
So we wanted to start out with a discussion of some of your recent pieces. As Bridget mentioned, your first piece as architecture critic for the Times focused on Via Verde, a subsidized housing development in the Bronx, which introduced readers to your critical approach. In the piece, you talk about shifting the conversation, and you do so right away by writing, and I'll just read a quick portion here. The profession, or in any case much talk about it, has been fixated for too long on brand name luxury objects and buildings as sculptures instead of attending to the richer, broader, urgent vein of public policy and community engagement in which aesthetics play a part. How did you arrive at this belief, and how do you foresee this shift happening?
Well, to arrive at the belief is a long time process. It doesn't happen because I sort of started writing about architecture exactly. I mean, my interest, I think I took on this job because my interests were in the intersection of culture and political and social affairs. You have to remember that I was an art critic for a long time, but I had been writing about other things outside art for a while, and then went to Europe for a number of years. And because I no longer was defined as the art critic, I think it was not clear always exactly what I was doing there. It can seem like I just had this fantastic job on holidays. But within each of the areas that I wrote about, I think, that is to say, if I was writing about, life in Gaza under Hamas, or what was going on in Syria, or Sarkozy's France or something, they were all, for me, a part of an attempt to reconnect cultural reporting and criticism with issues of how we live. So, so for me, it really wasn't a difficult transition to think of. It was no transition at all to think of writing in this way. I think the perception, the misperception, an entirely understandable one, was beforehand, when nobody knew, nobody was paying that much attention anyway, was to imagine that because I was an art critic, I would be interested in writing about buildings simply as sculptures, as extensions of the art, which I think has been an aspect of architectural writing, and not just writing, but the conversation. But to me, it was more important growing up in Jane Jacobs' Greenwich Village, and coming from my family background. So it was a perfectly natural subject. The task for me has been to catch up with the field and learn things from, I'm in many ways just trying to throw myself at the feet of people I trust and ask to be educated quickly about things that I hadn't been looking at closely for a long time. That's an advantage in many ways, I have to say.
And what about the shift in the field? Do you feel like you're needing to push that, or do you feel like that conversation's already happening and you're just sort of catching up?
I mean, what I do for the field? Or
Yeah.
Which field are we talking about?
Well, I guess architecture criticism, but just sort of this idea of shifting the conversation and you sort of outlining this approach that you're going to be taking.
Yeah.
Sort of
Well, let me just say that, here we are, right? We're interested in criticism, but I'm not really interested in criticism. I mean, I think this has to be said right at the beginning. No, but it's an important thing to say because I'm interested in the things we make and do and say that affect how we live and how we think. And as a critic, you have an opportunity to write about those things. And the ability to do that more or less vigorously, with more or less moral conviction or whatever it is, aesthetic excellence or whatever, and literary skill, that has to do with your abilities as a critic. But what interests me are those issues, those things, whether they're buildings or plans or paintings or whatever they happen to be. And I'm interested in the process of writing. I'm interested in being a writer. This matters to me a great deal. But the field of criticism itself, what other people are writing as critics, or whether criticism is a perennial subject, I guess, but it's of very little interest to me. I mean, I think there are other terrific critics out there. That's great. And there's always a temperature taking about the field, but I'm not doing what I'm doing because it has anything to do with architectural criticism. Other critics do what they're doing, that's great. I'm interested in politicizing the architecture critic's job and establishing it as it was, for instance, under Ada Louise Huxtable in the beginning, as a position of public policy and social concern. And that isn't in any way contradictory with the role that it's also an arts job as well. There is an aesthetic component to architectural criticism. But I think I wanted to establish in that first piece that this is my ambition is to repoliticize this job and to make it clear that this is about public policy and how we live.
Okay. And to that point, I think you are reshaping the public debate already about urbanism and architecture. Your piece from last weekend, which hopefully some of you had a chance to read, on restoring Penn Station to its former monumental glory by moving Madison Square Garden to the west side, is a really good example of this. We've been talking about it here, and I've heard other people, at Party of the Weekend talking about it, and it's really exciting, and people are sort of fired up and interested. And I was wondering if you could talk about, just for us, sort of how this piece came about, like the idea from the beginning to the printed.
Sure. I came back from Europe, and I just wanted to catch up with things. And one of the things I wanted to catch up with, what the hell happened at Penn Station? I remember leaving, and there was some discussion of it. And so I began to ask around, and I discovered interesting things. They were interesting to me. I thought they were not I didn't know whether they were well known, but I soon discovered they were not well known. For instance, there are 600,000 people or so, actually more if you include subway riders. These numbers are very fungible, actually. And I mean, depending on who you ask and how, but I think it's a fair number to say there are at least 550 to 600,000 non-subway riders who pass through Penn Station using it. And of those, 25,000, they're guessing 30,000 ultimately, of those were Amtrak riders. And only Amtrak is moving to Moynihan. So I thought, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, it didn't necessarily mean that Moynihan wasn't a good idea, but I thought, that's news. How did that happen? And then it just occurred to me that, well, why wasn't there an effort to do more? And then the answer I got was, well, there was a plan that had fallen apart with Client 9 versus Elliott Spitzer and with the falling economy that had these two, the partnership of these developers, called the venture, Milano and related, to move the garden into the back of Farley, essentially the back of the Moynihan building, the back of the Farley building behind Moynihan. And the garden had gone along with this for a fair amount of time, but then it fell apart. I thought, does everybody know that? That was interesting. Why did it fall apart, and what would that have turned out to be? So I was just, looking into it. And then I wanted to know whether that was the end of the story, because everyone would say, well, but then the garden decided to spend money, and they're renovating the building, so, that's that. Now, you have to understand also that, one of the things that happened to me in Europe is I got to see this, you see your home differently, and you see another place that's new to you with fresh eyes to it. A sort of naive take is useful, as I said. So I came back, and one of the very first things that I kept confronting was the acceptance here of a public-private partnership system in which everything is dependent upon private developers. And in many ways, the system works. But what Europe has, or certain parts of Europe, and what I grew to understand and admire living, was a social compact, an idea that there are certain basic things that a society does for its people. And these include basic services. They include healthcare, they include transportation, clean streets, all this kind of thing. And that this was not necessarily accepted here as a basic given. And I thought, well, in the case of this, what are we really saying? That because Madison Square Garden, the Dolan family, has decided that they want to stay put, that effectively 600,000 people a day, millions upon millions upon millions of train users are stuck. Because everyone agrees, I mean, this charming, perverse strain of, as always, there will be people who will say Penn Station's not so bad, but it effectively, everyone agrees that Penn Station is bad, and really that we depend upon the Dolan's largesse or whim to move or whatever. So then, feeling that can't be the end of the story. I'm sorry, it's a slightly long story, but I think it's useful to understand a little bit about how I'm thinking about the struggle. I thought, well, really? Maybe there's a way in which they can move. What are the legal levers that the state and city holds? So I looked into that, and I had no idea. What are the issues with the tracks, and with Amtrak, and with the layout of the infrastructure? Why can't Penn Station be moved? If it could, where could it be moved? What things can be moved within it? What are Amtrak's plans? What are the plans for the LIR? So all this sort of thing. Anyway, then Governor Cuomo makes this speech. I thought it was quite fascinating that the central plank of this State of the State speech, something most people don't pay attention to, is an urban development plan, which is really this excuse by Genting, a private Malaysian company, to build a huge gambling casino in Jamaica. But it had as its component the removal of the Javits Center in order to create, the largest convention center out of it. Essentially, Genting, in order to justify getting the rights to build a large gambling casino, had to provide something. So it said it would pay the state $4 billion and put up a casino, a convention center. Convention center is a money-losing operation, and I've seen the numbers, and there's no, it makes no difference to them whether it makes money if people go to Jamaica, because the casinos are going to make billions of dollars. So then I began to look into that plan and ask around. As a matter of fact, around that time I saw Ada Louise Fistol, and I was saying, "Did you read this plan?" And she said, "No, it's kind of interesting to us." And it is an interesting plan. I mean, it's totally unworked out, but I'll just say in brief, because I didn't flesh this out. You know, I talked to the congressman who represents Jamaica. I took all these politicians in Queens and so forth. You have to understand that, although it sounds horrible on the face of it, and it may well be a horrible plan in some ways, you're talking about a totally undeveloped, extremely poor area, heavy in immigrants. Convention centers and casinos generate hotels and restaurants, new hotels and restaurants, which are the #1 employer of first-time immigrants, new immigrants to town. So in fact, there is a kind of, although it's bottom feeding in terms of urban development, New York is a very large place. It's not like Cleveland trying to revive its downtown, which it's doing by building a convention center and opening a casino. It's a very particular thing. And I thought if it could be combined with certain promises to get these things which we need, infrastructural change, and Queens politicians and advocates, not all of them are happy with Jamaica, but they like that idea, they agree that makes sense. And then you have this West Side development, and it occurred to me, well, what about that site? I'd seen the High Line, I knew about the 7 development, the 7 line, there was actually a rail line, I didn't mention this in an article, dedicated between Penn Station and the Javits. So you could, in fact, even have a rail line that takes you straight from it. And I thought this made sense. I won't drone on about this, but I will say, so I talked to everybody. I talked to, the head of the Port Authority, the head of the MTA, every commissioner in town, every developer, Bruce Ratner, everybody I could find. And almost all of this had the same reaction, which was, forget it, it's ridiculous. And I said, no, but I mean, suppose, after all, this wouldn't take place for a few years, because all these things have to happen in this hypothetical thought exercise. And by which time the garden could be compelled. And to a person, they all, no matter what their interest, they all said, yeah, that is kind of interesting.
Right.
And I realized that it had a use, because what was my ultimate purpose? And now I'm getting to the answer to your question. I wanted to also emphasize that I saw my role as not simply a responsive one, but an activist one, that there has to be some advocacy position for an architecture critic. Generally a responsive position, and criticism on the whole is a responsive one, but this one is not necessarily. But it need not be. It should play a role in doing this precisely because the entire system is so volcanoized and so makes it so impossible for agencies, conflicting interests, community groups, all sorts of different people, as well as architects and designers, to talk to each other. And here's where I really think criticism matters deeply, that it is almost the only player in this game who can play, is almost the critic who's the only player who can play this role of saying, all right, well, what if this? Just to do a provocation. Did I think that everybody in the Governor Cuomo would the next day say, yes, Mike, you're right, this is what we're going to do? And the Dolans would say, of course, no. Although I've been pleased by the reaction to this, but I wanted to establish this. Because I thought, if you get a conversation going, especially in this city where everyone's feeling this, forget it. I mean, just
right.
That is insane. I mean, if you force people to talk about it again, to put it back on the table, something over time can develop. In fact, it is possible that something over time could develop in the form of a genuine public, I won't call it a movement, but some sort of organized effort to keep the question alive. And out of that, who knows, within a decade one might get something
right.
good.
Well, I mean, it seems like just from what we're saying, what we're talking about, that's sort of what it did, just in that little moment of, oh, the public good is worth something. And you tweeted over the weekend that we should reject a pervasive either or can't be done mentality, and I think that.
Yeah, look, I'm a realist like everybody else, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because of course there are different economic priorities, and not everything can be done. And we do need new tracks, we need a tunnel, we need high-speed rail, we need a lot of things. But there is this very cynical, and I think actually very dangerous cultural quality we have, in which everything that could be good is merely dismissed because of all the other things that are not us. Or this kind of, I don't know, smarter than you kind of thing, like, yeah, you don't like this, but actually, because you have this sort of handy-dandy, dreamy thing, but come on, let's face it, this is really fine as it is, it's really great, and besides which we want that. So there's, I think we have to, as a society, and I say this not just about architectural criticism or New York, but I think we have to accept the idea that it is our responsibility as citizens to challenge ourselves and others to do better, and for a large number of people. And the easy way out, the self-defeating process is to say things cannot be done. Is this plan going to happen tomorrow? No. Can it actually happen? Are the finances possible? Is all this actually really possible? Yes, it actually is. Somewhere in the space between forget it and it is possible, something can happen. But not if we continue to believe that, just, I don't know. It's really interesting how cynical people here are.
Sure.
And this is, again, a difference between here and Europe, where people, obviously now there's lots of doubt, but there's generally a faith and a belief that things will get accomplished that serve a general common good.
I think you answered my next question, which was about the role of the critic in that process, so I'll jump into that.
So you've covered a wide range of topics, subsidized housing, by Wall Street, bike lanes, parking spaces, libraries. How do you define architecture in terms of what you covered? And are you working to expand our definition of what architecture encompasses?
I thought it encompassed all those things and a lot of other things too. I mean, the beauty of the field, right, is that it's a vast array of things about how we live, and buildings are part of it. Infrastructure is part of it, public space is part of it, all these things are part of it. I would say that probably there was, and I was alluding to this in the very, there was a period of time for a variety of reasons during which architecture came to be understood by a large part of the public as meaning buildings of exceptional formal ambition. And that is, without question, an important part of architecture. But, okay, there's a picture of Jane Jacobs. I mean, I don't actually think Jane Jacobs cared very much about what buildings looked like. But I think most people here would regard her as a very important signal figure in the history of urbanism and architecture. I mentioned Ada Louise the other day. Ada Louise said to me, I have never, that was not in the past tense, she said, I have never reviewed a private building or a private luxury apartment, never. And that's her way of saying to me, and I don't So, I mean, I went to look, I was with Frank Gehry and looked at the building, that rental building. My only thing that I will say, as not a critic, but as a lifelong New Yorker, is you'd have to be crazy to pay $18,000 a month to rent one of those three things. But I mean, that's part of the field too. And I will anticipate a question that I suppose maybe we're going to head towards, which is, I've been doing this for like 4.5 months. It's not really very long, right? So, and there's a lot of things to do. So the fact that I have a review of Frank Gehry building does not mean I'm allergic to Frank Gehry buildings. I mean, it's crazy. And I spent 20 years writing about aesthetic matters. You know, that of course, I have every intention of writing about buildings in different ways. But if you ask what actually interests me, I mean, I'm writing about what I believe in and what interests me. That interests me too. But I think from the reaction I also hear, you know, it's always hard to judge this, but you know, I think there are millions of professionals in a lot of different fields who, including thousands of architects and urban planners and so forth, designers, who are hungry for a conversation about the role of architecture that extends beyond the discussion of, you know, celebrityhood and a few particular designers who are very talented and important, but not the whole subject.
To that point, in the Penn Station piece over the weekend, you asked your readers a question, and we'd like to ask it back to you. What, as you see it, is the value of architecture?
I thought I answered that question. Well, look, I mean, I did partly answer it by saying that I think one of the values of architecture, you do see it in Grand Central, is an ennobling social good. And I don't mean to sound, you know, sort of like a tired old liberal, but I mean, I think it's true. Grand Central is a perfect example. Via Verde, to me, was an example of the larger good of architecture. Let me go back to that for a second. I don't want to harp on this social aspect entirely, but I mean, why did I choose Via Verde to start with? Because it presented a very particular, in my mind, it seemed to me to present a very particular approach to the issue of architectural quality. You know, it's not that I haven't been writing about buildings. I wrote about that building, I wrote about the libraries, I mean, but what I was not doing was talking about them entirely in terms of the architect as a work within the body of this architect's career, or entirely in formal terms. Not that anybody has done that, but I'm just saying I wanted to say Via Verde presents an interesting question. It takes the issue of quality, a premium for making a better building aesthetically and otherwise. And the amount that costs literally has to be weighed against that same amount of money and investment being given over to create more housing, more affordable housing. So housing advocates, this is what attracted me to Via Verde in the first place, because this argument was very clearly framed. I mean, I talked to many people about this, from Sean Donovan, head of HUD, to the developers and other people too, and many housing advocates. It was very clearly framed. Housing people would say, you know, it's very nice, but we could build X number of more units. And there are people out there, families with children, without homes. So one has to then say, well, so why do you build this building? Does architecture have a value, a social value, and a larger value? And the answer to me is yes, it does, because in that case, it creates, it enhances the quality of the neighborhood. It adds pride to the community. It gives people an investment in their homes. It's about things that people will continue to value over time, and therefore people will upkeep the building and in turn that neighborhood. It's because not every building has to look like Geary's Bilbao, but some buildings in neighborhoods should be foreground buildings, and they should anchor or define the neighborhood. Yes, there is a value to that, especially, in fact, in neighborhoods where, in underprivileged neighborhoods, or neighborhoods where you need to create some sense that they exist in the same world that they, as the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side of the village. It's extremely important. So, again, I'll give you a very long-winded answer, but I hope I'm covering some territory. I mean, that's a value of architecture. Is there also a value to, you know, incredibly beautiful, formally interesting, innovative buildings? Yes. I mean, of course. But I think we impoverish the field and the discussion if we evacuate all of the other surrounding issues because we have this opportunity in architecture, which, by the way, I did not have as an architect, to see how these things actually work and to weigh all these different factors which make this field so beautiful and rich and meaningful. And I think we're doing a disservice, even to the architects we write about, to treat buildings as if they don't exist in a social context. Sometimes that context is very straightforward and light. But I think there is always one.
So then would you say that is your job, or are you looking to create a dialogue between your readers and the public, the larger field of architecture, and open their eyes to something that maybe they didn't notice? Or
Sure, that would be great. No, of course, I mean, I have this wonderful opportunity, right? I have this great position. And so people look at the New York Times. So I have responsibilities. I have to, first of all, I can't be incompetent. There's a learning curve. I came into this admitting to everyone that there are a lot of things I need to learn. And I think it's foolish, and may I say to those of you who are learning to be critics that, but this is just a basic thing about reporters. It's really hard. It can be very hard to say, I don't know, tell me, I don't know. And to acknowledge the limits of what you've learned, or just whatever. But it is the essence of good reporting. There are these wonderful stories about, the greatest reporters like Homer Bigger, the speaker of the New York Times, who used to go around, he was covering the South, and there was this Southern, really racist governor in the Civil Rights days who hated him because Bigger would ask him to say something, and then he'd say, I'm sorry, I don't understand, can you repeat that? And he would do it over and over and over. So the governor thought he was a complete idiot. But of course, Bigger was a genius. He was a fabulous reporter because what he was in fact doing was getting this governor to explain again and again and give more information. This ability to, admit what you don't know. Well, in his case, it was a strategy. But it's really essential. So, I don't know how I can drift off into the subject, but, for me, part of this is, a learning process, and as I said, I think it's useful to come to it. But I'm not quite as naive as I think people might have assumed at the beginning. And I do think that it's part of my responsibility, I take it as this, is to restore to this particular position what Ada Louise established it as, which is a position of public policy that happens to be marooned in the arts pages.
Well, you've talked about it a little bit, but you've been a music critic, an art critic, an architecture critic, and is there something in the field of criticism that you wouldn't get in some other field, or as opposed to being an architectural writer or reviewer? Is there something in criticism or the venue of criticism that you hate?
Well, now you're getting to the question of what is criticism as opposed to reviewing or just reporting or being a writer for the New Yorker or something to write about building.
Just what keeps you interested in that, as you've moved in criticism itself.
Yeah. Well, I started as a music critic because I'm a musician. So I made a little extra money writing music reviews. Actually, my first job was working for ID magazine right out of college. And I was the editor, was one of the two editors really of ID magazine. It was a job at a school I fell into. It was really incredibly good luck because I knew nothing, and here I was putting together the magazine, half the magazine, the front and the back of the book, commissioning all these people, having to write things. It was an immersion in this year right after college in design and architecture, but also in journalism. So that was the first writing I did, but then I started to do some music criticism on the side. That is a very particular form, anyway, classical music criticism, classical musician. It's a very particular form. And I chafed at the limitations of it really early on. Because for a newspaper, it's very short, and it's usually about differences in performances of things. It wasn't so much a creative thing. It was very hard to, but I was learning my way around. Well, what happened was ultimately graduate school things. But when I got to the Times, I was writing some. I came there as a music critic, but very quickly, within a couple of months, the art critic at that time, a very great Englishman named John Russell, asked me if I wanted to, because I was trained as an art historian, I wanted to do art criticism, and I said no. Because having been an academic art historian, I had contempt for newspaper criticism and art critics. I thought they didn't know anything, it was just the right criticism. I didn't even read them. I read John a little because he'd written a couple of books on Francis Bacon, and a fabulous book on Seurat. But otherwise I thought there was no criticism. So I had this weird, completely dysfunctional view of things. But then I tried to do a little art criticism, and I thought, well, this is much more creative. Because first of all, I'm writing about the artists and original work. And the form was much more, it allowed more interesting forms of writing. And so I switched very quickly. And I'd made a fool of myself in public doing that for a little while as I was trying to learn how to do that. And then I began to chafe at the forms of art criticism and also at the art world, which is another subject we don't have to go into here. But I just grew very quickly tired of it. And by the way, I started when I was doing art criticism, doing a lot of reporting and kind of, this is not exactly like this, but, investigative things about deaccessioning, museum policies and stuff like that. For various reasons that, the art world is a limited thing. So, I couldn't spend my entire life doing that. But I liked art criticism because first of all, there were interesting artists to write about, the forms of profile writing. I liked the idea of inventing new forms, from scratch, for myself, yeah. So I think many critics, newspaper critics, they can be very strong by doing one particular thing, or not just newspaper, but Peter Sheldon, for instance, in the New Yorker, is a wonderful critic, but Peter does one thing. He writes 1,200 words, and he writes these reviews, and he's a fabulous writer. But that's what he's comfortable doing. He doesn't write 5,000-word profiles, or write books, or do other things. I admire Peter enormously. I don't mistake what I'm saying. But for me, I needed to feel like I was writing in other ways. So I started writing some new books. So again, it wasn't just like I was saying about being a critic. It was a single thing. And then finally, I just grew tired of the art world, tired of the art writing, and feeling that it was extremely limited. Above all, I have to say, nobody asked me, but as I implied at the beginning, because it had become a kind of little rich bubble, and the conversation was very poor. Really, it was an impoverished. It had become an impoverished place. Not that there weren't wonderful artists, and dealers, and curators, and whatever, but the conversation about it was really very, very poor. And I just grew tired of it, and I thought, there's got to be some other way. And so, I'm beyond grateful, but I'd spent a long time at the Times, and I had a pile of chips and editors like me, and so I, finagled this Europe gig. And that was really the transition to this that made the most sense.
And you have a very different style and critical voice than any of your other predecessors, Nikolai Rusov or Paul Goldberger. How have you formed, or how are you forming your voice in terms of your approach and style as the architecture?
You skipped somebody who actually, Herbert had a fabulously strong voice and was a very interesting character. Listen, I have to say right off the bat, this is completely the case. I'm not writing with anybody else in mind. I really am not. It's enough to do my own job. So, and I admire my predecessors who had very different approaches to doing things. If I had to choose somebody who I really admire, I've now mentioned her twice. I obviously, you also skipped her. I mean, I think we really need to acknowledge that Amy Louise is the founding critic of the fields anyway in newspapers, and Jacobs too. You have these two extraordinary women who created much of the public conversation. There was Mumford and many others. I think that when I write, I want to be a good writer. And I want people to read something I've written and think, oh, this is a good writer, and I think one of the things that attracted me to the art world, but then especially to Europe, was the ability to tell stories, have characters, narrative, because I think this brings to life, first of all, it's writing, it's the very nature of writing, we tell stories. And because criticism, for many reasons that have to do, to a large extent, with the academic world, increasingly became insular and it began to service an industry. I thought there was a way of writing that was extremely straightforward. So developing a voice that is really clear and accessible is, of course, very hard. One hopes that when one has read everything that seemed like it just came right out. Of course, it's not easy. So that's certainly an ambition. Because what I'm doing now, I believe in. I don't think that I'm, doing anything heroic. What I mean is, I choose to write what I'm writing. I find my subjects, and that means that I have a certain enthusiasm for them, and I have arrived at an opinion in them through the process. This is also very important. What I mean by this is, especially in the art world, but in a lot of other forms of criticism, you're like a hamster on the wheel. Yeah? A new exhibition opens, a new a concert happens, whatever it happens to be, whatever field, the book is published, you have to respond. There's a wonderful quality to that. Among other things, you don't have to make too many decisions. But I grew to loathe it. I just loathed it. And so what I really loved about being here was that I forced myself to find stories that did not exist, and so to have to justify them in the writing process. And the one thing that we have as architecture critics is so many possible things to write about that it isn't as if everyone can agree that this is the thing that must be done. And so in the process of educating myself and finding my own bearings, coming from the outside, I have landed on these. Nobody has presented to me any of the things I have written. Nobody came to me and said you should write about bike lanes. What happened with bike lanes was, of course I wrote a bike ground rule and everyone was riding bikes. I thought, oh, bike lanes, that's great. And I thought, I guess I would write about bike lanes, but I'm surely everyone here loves bike lanes, so that's probably not a good idea. And then I started to hear, that's really. So I thought, great, bike lanes. So it's not a forced thing. I don't feel like I have to affect. I didn't affect the idea that I think Penn Station should, be improved. This is not hard to affect. And let me just say this, by the way. For those of you who think you become critics for whatever reason. There are uses, and it is inherent within the job of being a critic that you often find your opinion in the process of writing. It is not something you can just have. And you certainly shouldn't have it in this field where reporting is very crucial. Right? You asked about the NYU project. So I'm a villager, born and raised in the village. So I have family in the village. Family still lives in the village. And my aunt is at every one of these rallies. She was there on Saturday. My cousins are there. Everyone's at these rallies. So if I just did what I'm supposed to do as a villager, I would tell you that the NYU project sucks. And it's a disaster for the neighborhood. But that's not my job. So I went around with the people from NYU and talked to them. I've talked to NYU professors about it. I went to the rally myself. I did I don't know what my own position is about this because I haven't finished looking into it, and I don't think it'd be right to say that I think that the development is on the face of it bad. I'm not quite sure it is. Whether that's a gambit by NYU, and whether there isn't other ways that NYU, or other ways that NYU could develop that same area. You have to remember, I not only know that area, but I have friends in every one of those buildings. I grew up going into those buildings. I know Silver Towers, and I know the interior of the apartments. I played in those parks. So I have a really intimate knowledge of this, which actually affects how I look at this, and not necessarily negatively about NYU's plan. So what am I doing? I may or may not write about it, I don't know. But I think that I bring to that, therefore, responsibility to ask around, to look into it. I had this great opportunity, a critic had this great opportunity. You can ask people questions. They'll actually return your phone calls and stuff. It's great. And they sit down and explain things to you. It's really cool. And I also have a personal history, which I think I have to be honest about, and which actually may help. It certainly will shape what I think in some way that may not mean that my opinion is the best one you could get, but it'll be an honest one. But I was going to say that process of discovering what you think is really one of the pleasures of being a critic. I found with art writing, it happened literally while I was doing the writing. I didn't even think beforehand what I thought. I just discovered it in the process of writing, and I think that's extremely common. And I think it's one of the great privileges we have as writers. What distinguishes you from being just a reporter? Mm-hmm. And by the way, let me say one last thing about that. The art world had a lot of trouble, or not really, but there are people who are focused on issues of criticism who have a lot of trouble, for reasons I simply don't understand, accepting the idea that you can do different kinds of writing, that there are different ways in which you can use voice. So as an art critic, I wrote about, let's say, I did a profile of Gerhard Richter, I did a profile of Michael Heiser, and these sort of things. These are, magazine length, whatever, 8,000 word pieces, 5,000 word pieces. I think they're a form of criticism in a way. I don't care about the definition of what is criticism and what is not. But my exercising my judgment and using my writing is to do something, to say something. And in the process of which one reports, which is what any good critic should be doing anyway. The fact that there were these different forms, that not everything came out in the form of a review, or said, here is my definite opinion. For some reason, I don't know why, I think it has to do with limited ideas about what writing is and criticism is. And maybe because of the lack of utility in the marketplace for certain kinds of writing. But I think as critics, one should have the ability, especially if you have aspirations as a writer, to work in different forms and to be able to, for instance, admit that you don't have anything.
Right. So, on the topic of public conversation, let's open it up now to Q&A for students or Amanda?
You mentioned that early on in your career you learned on the job by experimenting and made a fool of yourself. I know you're being...
I like you did this, but made a fool of yourself. You can take away the quotation.
Completely self-deprecating, I'm sure. But do you think it's difficult for young critics today to do that same thing, given the new media platforms? Everything's so intense, so public, so competitive, that we don't have that opportunity to make a fool of ourselves and find our voice out.
I just think you have too many opportunities to make a fool of yourself. And I think that because of the sort of cacophony of voices and the way the web works, which in many ways is wonderful, of course, there is an inclination to try to attract too much attention by saying something that's not irrational, just extreme or attention-getting or whatever.
Sensationalist.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, not that there's an enormous amount of this, but one sees it. And I think that's the problem. Looking back, actually what I did in the beginning, because remember, I was trained as an art historian, but I didn't come out of the contemporary art world. And the contemporary era was where most art critics come from. And, you know, I grew up literally in the midst of it. My mother was an artist, but it wasn't really my area. And many people become critics in the way they become dealers or artists because they want to be in the art world. And so, but I already had friends, so I didn't like go into the art world for that reason. And so in that sense, I was trying to find my bearings. And I made a conscious decision not to do anything that I really wasn't comfortable with as critic, because I feared, I remember thinking this at some point early on, I feared that if I did something extreme, that it would mark me forever. I'd rather slowly make a mark than do that. Was that wise? I don't know. I mean, in some ways, that made the process longer. It did establish me as a serious person over time. But I think probably left an impression with some people that I was tepid or something, I don't know, something like this. So, I mean, but I think in the end, it's going to sound like pathos, but you have to really, you have to have the strength of your convictions behind something. And it's very important to have voices in the back of your head saying, voices of people out there who are critical of you, who are going to say, but you can't anticipate everything, and especially if you're a position like mine, there are going to be a million people who are, or who just want your attention, and they'll try to get it by saying something nasty about you or something, right? You can't protect yourself entirely. And I have to say that because, of course, nobody likes to be criticized. Yeah? But I do think that once one really exercises critical judgment and thinks clearly about things, most things exist in the world of gray. Very few things are really black and white. And your ability as a critic depends upon your making clear where you come in that gray matter and why. Arguing for a position that has to be rational, and so that it isn't just based on sensational thoughts. But it is hard now. And look, I'm very privileged to have a position where I don't have to raise my voice to be heard, because this is not a common thing. I understand this. No, I won't call people.
You said that you want to kind of change architecture so that it's coming from a position of public policy. Do you think that puts an impetus on architects to have a better understanding of policy and what drives the buildings, particularly when it comes to subsidized housing?
Yeah.
To really understand the policy that will drive what those structures look like aesthetically?
Yeah, I mean, when I say, I'm not presumptuous enough to think that I'm going to be telling architects what to do or anything like that, but I do think, as I said, that I exist at this, I have a soapbox, and I think that there is a public conversation, and there's certainly a hunger for a public conversation about issues like this, about issues of infrastructure, public space, all this, what was Occupy Wall Street about? To me, that was like the greatest opportunity. It's like I just started my job a week earlier or two, and then, here was this theme that raised the question about public space, and the meaning of public space and the lack of it. So I think because there is a desire to have this conversation, it will become incumbent upon architects. Many of them are perfectly articulated this, and sometimes they just haven't been asked. But yes, for architects to begin to speak in ways that it's part of the job. They're also trying to sell projects. So if that's what people are interested in, there it is.
Can you talk a little bit about the intersection of aesthetics and politics as it pertains to architecture?
The intersection of aesthetics and politics. Well, I mean, I think it's very hard to do in a general way, to be honest with you. I don't see why they are, let me back up and say, aesthetics are inseparable from politics. and we're not going to do a class in theory here. I used to teach theory classes, right?
That's why I asked.
Well, let's avoid this. I want to answer it in a more straightforward way. I think I guess I would just have to come back to the point that when you, I'll give an example. It's actually maybe easiest. I would go to Rome all the time down when I was there. And Zaha Hadid's museum opened there, and I saw it in all of its stages, and I saw it when it was installed, and I gave a lecture there, and I've spent time. It's a building that has a function, and its aesthetics, that is its forms, are related to its function. They affect its function. They affect its function in different ways. First of all, the function of the building is to change the neighborhood and attract people to go there, and to go to the neighborhood, right? So one aesthetic question is the ability of the building to do that. It was its particular task. It was the brief, part of the brief. Aesthetically, though, the building also is shaped in ways that affect how art is installed in it, how things happen in the building, in fact, how people move in the building. Right? Even the stairs are constructed very specifically by her to affect how you move through that building. Adversely, I think. And so, how can one really talk about that building without, aesthetically, without addressing these other issues? I just don't know how one does that. I really don't. I mean, of course, it's done, it can be done, but to me, it's a failure to address the meaning of aesthetics. I mean, if I treated that building as a sculptural object, and look, I've spent my life talking to people like Richard Serra about this too. You know, it's the difference between Serra and Gehry. I mean, you know, they work together, and they have strong opinions about each other, but what Richard is doing is very different than what Gehry is doing. And there are responsibilities that go along with a Gehry building. It's just ridiculous to talk about it as if it doesn't. I mean, it's the most obvious thing to say. Those responsibilities are not the same as Richard's. Richard has other responsibilities. So though they share formal qualities, and though they have developed forms in similar ways, and though they leave an impact on the history of art and architecture that is linked for formal reasons, that you cannot talk about Gehry's Bilbao in the way you talk about Richard's sculptures inside that Bilbao building. I don't think.
Picking up on some of the conversations, I'm an architect, and I am not a critic, and I don't practice in work in a communications role, but I'm wondering, is it appropriate as a critic to be in a dialogue with architects?
What do you mean by dialogue?
Well, among my clients, among my colleagues, we're talking about all these issues,
Sure.
and we don't really have an opportunity for a public discussion in that many different places, especially people who are not the big brand names that everybody knows. But that doesn't mean the dialogue isn't going on, and isn't going on at a high level.
Right.
But there isn't access to a venue for that conversation to become more public and to become more shared. And you know, I would say even more so with very young architects who have some fantastic ideas and who are doing brilliant and really fascinating things in obscure places.
Yep.
And yet you never see them.
Right.
To what extent is it appropriate to enter into that kind of a dialogue?
You mean for me too?
Yeah.
I'm
for
hungry
critics.
for such conversation, of course. And you know, listen, I mean, it's not a mistake that the architects I've talked to about, I've mentioned so far. I mentioned Poolhouse on purpose in this last thing, but I mean, you know, I talked about Interborough for a reason. You know, I think it was interesting. I want to have another list of names in the New York Times. You guys don't know who they all are, but I think it's useful. So I'm actually anxious to go out there and look for people who are saying interesting things. And let me just say one quick thing. So, you know, I went to the zoning conference that maybe some of you attended as well, and I've been to a bunch of other meetings and things. And it's really great that to be in a community of people who actually know what they're talking about. You know, this does not happen in our world. You do not go to these are not meetings where people all say really interesting things. I mean, not that everything everyone says is great, but I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. There's a huge wealth of interesting people and knowledge, and I am, struggling to find my way to these. That said, it's not my job to to become a mouthpiece for anybody or to turn the New York Times into such a thing either. But I think it is my job to look widely and be open and receptive when I hear that there are interesting people out there doing interesting things. And they may be people who are very much, English, for instance, interests me as a manifestation of marketing in the architecture world these days. So there are issues of notoriety that I think are also interesting. But I don't know. I don't think most of the public had heard of Interborough. But
York Eagles.
well, if not yet, so surely.
In your first 4.5 months, you focused almost exclusively on work in New York and by New York architects.
Yeah.
Are you going to expand that? I mean, some of your predecessors were famous for spending most of their time on jets.
On jets. Yes, of course I'll expand that, and yeah, I mean I'm going to be on a jet much for the next month. I did go to Madrid, and I was doing other things when I was there, and you'll see what they result in at some point. But I'm going back. I thought that it was very important to write. First of all, look, I mean, New York's the coolest place to write about, so I'm very fortunate. I could be the critic of the Toledo Blade or something, and then I'd have Toledo write that. And there'd be things, but here's such a wealth of opportunity. So just all this stuff presented itself to me. Plus, it's my home, and so I care about it. I also think it's very important to establish something as your base. And then I really wanted to do this in an increasingly fine-grained way, to tell people that it mattered on an increasingly fine way, down to the block and down to the storefront, that kind of thing. So that there was none of this kind of parachuting into something. There will be parachuting that I'll have to do. But yes, I wanted to establish that. Of course, I find it slightly funny, but I just started to do this, like, oh my God, he's just a New York critic. It's like, you can't win for losing. But yeah, I want to make New York a constant ground over this. And I think it should be. I mean, it's my job. I'm the critic of the New York Times.
I think a lot of people criticize some of your predecessors for forgetting about those and moving back the other.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not being polite. I don't. Whatever happened in the past is not really my concern, and isn't really the issue. The question is now what is presented to us as the issues and what are the opportunities. And I think, there are places now in the world that I'm very interested in going. Do I think that the issues that they raise are relevant in New York and to New Yorkers and to everybody else who reads the Times? Absolutely. You will recall about that. Early on, I wrote about that Cooper Hewitt show that was at the UN, and I said I would go traveling to these places, and I meant it. But I think issues of informal housing and urban redevelopment in many poor places is extremely important, and it is a matter of architecture, and there's some really interesting things being done. So I will do that. I'll also, by the way, going to Europe shortly, and I'm just going to write about a couple of buildings I want. So, I mean, it's a really cool job. I'm very lucky.
Okay, maybe one more and then we'll wrap up.
I'm delighted that you're doing what you're doing.
There's a butt coming.
New shop used to make me throw up.
Okay.
And there used to be, you were talking about dialogue, there used to be something called the City Club, which made a point of having informal discussions once a week of various issues. and for whatever reason, they sort of dwindled and are no longer in existence.
Right.
But I'm sorry that there isn't something like that
Well,
that could actually encourage a dialogue,
Yeah.
because it's a very healthy thing.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, of course, there are things. I was doing a talk discussion at the Urban Forum, and there are groups around town, and I don't know how big discussions can be. I will say that very early on, in fact, from the first piece, I really wanted to establish a site on the Times website for a kind of discussion. So I actually said we were going to do this blog thing or something, some place where people could put, and I started to tweet a little bit about stuff like this. It turns out to be very difficult to do. Much harder than I anticipated, and for reasons I don't entirely understand, to establish this. But I imagine that the Times website itself could be a kind of open space. I like the idea of a public space.
Enough response?
You know, some place for conversation and dialogue, and I would occasionally enter into it if there was something useful. You know, it turns out you need, you know, of course, then you have to have editors, and these sites, when they're often established, they're sort of taken over by crazy people. So it's very difficult, apparently, to do. I thought Twitter might be a place to, I'm still trying to figure out the uses of Twitter, and I mean, I think it's great, but that's not exactly what I meant. I agree with you that it's nice to have a conversation. I've been pleased that the articles that I've done have been accompanied by comments, and some of them are quite interesting, and you know, I think that's great. I wish it were an ongoing thing, and that there was a way of turning those comments into real conversations, but occasionally there have been, and I think that's good.
So on that note, we'll have to find you on Twitter to continue the conversation, but please join us again in thanking Michael Kimmelman